Hello, hello. Welcome back to the second half of the conference. Let's have a bit of noise. Let's get lunch out of our bellies. I hope you've had as inspiring time as I have this morning. You know, it's been fascinating to hear from all these different perspectives about how we might change this situation, how we might be able to invest in a way that positively supports the world, that positively changes it. But before we begin, I want to introduce you to someone who's been sitting over there throughout the whole conference. I've been sat there writing a poem, and right here we have Javi from Migrants in Culture. She's been doing visual notes. Javi, would you come to the stage and show us what you've managed to come up with? Round of applause, please. Amazing. She's been sat there taking notes throughout the whole of this morning's proceedings. Let's find out what she discovered.
Hi everyone. So I'll just very quickly introduce myself. I'm Javi, and I'm from an organization called Migrants in Culture. We're a migrant-led design agency, and we try to resource activists and organizers to build more powerful and creative social movements, and also to help imagine a world without borders as well. I'm just sitting over there doing some visual notes, so please come and say hi. You can't really see, but here are some notes I made. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javi. Brilliant. There are all kinds of creative ways of exploring this subject matter as well, as you'll see throughout today. In fact, when we end up, we'll have Corinne Parkins Brown, who's a poet, coming on here and giving us a set and also summarizing the day. But now, you can see behind me our esteemed panel. Beyond Philanthropy, Radical Imaginings to Radical Practice, with the speakers Imi Kaur, Stephanie Brobby, Song Hae Park, Raji Hunjan, and facilitated by Kiki Mager. Please welcome.
Thank you. Is that working? Great, thank you. Welcome to the third session of today. It's lovely to have so many of you with us. I feel like more people are still slowly dropping in, which is beautiful. Good afternoon. I'm Kiki Mager, Director of Resource Mobilization at Good Ancestor Movement. I'm going to be introducing everyone with us shortly. But before that, I wanted to ground us a little bit why this session, it is here today. For us at Good Ancestor Movement, we've since the early days really grappled with this idea of philanthropy and it being kind of the default assumed good to be doing when you want to be redistributing your wealth, right? And we really wanted to understand, hang on a minute, how can we actually move beyond that? Because philanthropy, in the end, is a symptom of an unjust system, right? It's a symptom of a system that redistributes resources unfairly, and that is very much built on oppression, extraction, and dispossession, as we've heard earlier today as well. So for us at Good Ancestor Movement, the question really is, what is required of funders if we seek to instead move to a place where wealth is not hoarded, but shared and collectively stewarded? So what kind of resourcing, to use a different term, do we need to step into to kind of build that place where communities have regained sovereignty over meeting their needs, stewarding their productive capacity, and where economies are also relocalized, redemocratized, and power is not enacted over, but power is actually shared with. With the rise of authoritarianism around us and the many crises we're seeing, change is not just in the air, change is inevitable. And this really opens a window of opportunity for us in terms of we can leverage the power that capital still has in order to shift course in that moment of uncertainty, right? As space opens up, as the kind of dominant economy is in this very, very, very slow draining process of dying, essentially. But there is a window of opportunity to shift course. And what is the kind of resourcing that is required to meet that moment at scale and at pace? I guess that is what we will be exploring with you all today. I guess the question is, just to refer back to the title also, radical in the end is always a departure from where we are at. So I guess that's also the other kind of framing for today. And with that, I want to bring in two examples, two kind of experiments, demonstrators that we at Good Ancestor Movement have been, have started and have been practicing in this past year. One is with the Catalytic Collective, which is a space where we are collectivizing wealth holders in our community around a pooled fund. So it's a pooled fund that is mobilizing resources, providing multi-year grants in a kind of flexible way, and it's governed by a movements-led governance structure. So it's not as Good Ancestor Movement, it's not the funders, the wealth holders, but it's a kind of movement governance structure who's making decisions where and how these funds should be deployed. And it's all resourcing the solidarity economy space. And as we're speaking, the first round of resources are just being sent out, which is really exciting that it coincided with this day today. So yeah, that's one thing. A few of our solidarity partners are in the space, which is also really exciting. And then the second example is actually something that connects all of us here on stage as well. We've been doing a lot of work at Good Ancestor Movement on how can we also leverage, I guess, investments and tap into the space of what does non-extractive, regenerative, and transformative investment really look like, right? How can we push a bit, bridge the gap, I guess, and use investments as a key resourcing tactic in this kind of moment we're in. And I'm really excited we were able to support Civic Square. So Imi Kaur is with us, co-founder of Civic Square. We were able to support at Civic Square with their land acquisition or securing the land for their neighborhood public square site in Birmingham by exactly offering that, by providing non-extractive, regenerative, repayable grants. We are not allowed to do investments yet, but the idea, the structure, the models is essentially, it's modeling an investment. So that's quite exciting, and we'll dive into that a bit more in a minute. So with us today is Stephanie Brobby, CEO and co-founder of Good Ancestor Movement, founder of Good Ancestor Movement, and then we have Imi Kaur, co-founder of Civic Square. We have Raji Hunjan from CEO at Tudor Trust, and we have Sunghae Park, who is partner and co-lead of development finance at Bates Wells. So I'll be handing over to Imi with the first question, I guess, to just share a little more about this, securing the land of the neighborhood public square site, and kind of your experience of that, especially of the resourcing element of that, any learnings.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's really feels like it's a long time in the making to get to this moment where we're sitting here and talking about something that has happened that I guess in many different ways at Civic Square and in the wider movements we've been part of, we've been kind of trying to work towards for longer than we should have, but hopefully this is the beginning of a story where this becomes much more confident and possible for many more. And I guess there's two things I just want to say before I start, which is one, I think it's important to hear anything that I say in the context that we are firmly 1 foot in this neoliberal capitalist extractive system and 1 foot trying to build the regenerative futures, right? There is not a pure and perfect everything within this story. And I think that's a really important context to situate some of what I'm going to share in. And also just more broadly that I think we just really need to acknowledge what it means to even talk about land stewardship and the building of infrastructure right now in the UK, in the belly of the colonial beast, when all around us we can see the horror of violent dispossession of land and resources from our kin happening in real time, right? And I think it's being able to hold this tension of what it even means to be able to say, oh yeah, we need to do all these things, because it's kind of there's a whole different conversation about that. So just situating these two contradictions and layers in this, I think, is really, really important. And we move to try and think, what does it mean to build any kind of regenerative future, any kind of reparative and just future, while sitting in the heart of this story, is something that we've been grappling with for a long time. And so Civic Square, we're based in Ladywood in Birmingham, an inner city neighbourhood, and our focus is very much on what it means to build civic infrastructure that puts neighbourhoods and the communities that live in them at the forefront of their climate, economic, ecological transition. If we accept it in some very rough way, because we'll have lots of different ways we'll get to this same story. The old story's broken, it has been for a long time. The new one is struggling to be born. There's lots of different framings and different folks who've done brilliant work on this. And somewhere in the middle, all through history, we know when we need to make huge transitions of this kind, we need to unlock a role for everyone. We know from our ancestors and our kin that when we worked collectively and in community and we stewarded the land and we stewarded the ways in which we could move from time to time and to look at what our communities needed, this was something that we can see in the UK and in many different histories often needs infrastructuring. And so for us, this story is not just about Civic Square. It's about quite a few much bigger things into which the land story, I think, becomes relevant. Because I think if we get obsessed with land and assets, we'll recreate the same thing that we are trying to shift. And that's why in this little 10-minute intro that I've got, I just want to give some context to that. I think that we are part of a bold and emerging ecosystem and ecologies across the UK who are working at the intersection of place. Place can be defined in many different ways, but in our case, it's the home, street, and neighbourhood, a scale big enough to feel like we can understand how to do this over and over in ways that are contextually and creatively correct for those places, and is small enough to feel the intimacy of what it means to organise in the backdrop of everything we're facing. We think we're at the intersection of organisations that are working with neighbours and the communities that live at the heart of these places, human and more than human. We think we're at the intersection of a whole range of organisations that are understand the deep role of civic and social infrastructures, especially physical infrastructure, in a time where in the UK we have, by design, dismantled the spaces and places and lands in which we come together. And in many ways, much of the work that we find ourselves as part of is a bold and emerging ecosystem understanding the critical role between community and climate resilience, what it looks like now, what it looks like in the future. And I think many of these types of work are working with honesty, imagination, and critically tangibility in places. So we're not talking, and if I start giving names of all the different types of places, there'll be someone I miss out, so I'm not doing that for now. But there are urban and rural and inner city and coastal and all the suburban contexts in between. There are examples in all of these different places of folks thinking about this. Some might be starting from empty homes, others might be starting from farming, others might be starting from architecture or the built environment or new build housing for communities, or in our case, civic infrastructures. But they're all coming at this from different parts of the story, but understanding how critical civic and community resilience is to climate resilience, and what the access to having stewardship over the land means practically now in this place in terms of rewriting this story, but also what it has historically meant. And there's tons of work like this. And so I think what's so critical for us as well in this work is that most folks are really understanding that we need to take an approach, just to use this language because it's more well known, of multi-solving, right? We can't be like, we'll do this first and then we'll do that. And then after we'll sort housing out first, then we'll sort out the food system, and then we'll do this. Kate Ray was in the room, you've got the book. We've breached 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries. We never did and never should have been working in this Western colonial mindset of separating out all these entangled systems. But right now it's criminal to sit at what we're looking at and know that we can continue in that way. There just isn't the space and time. And it isn't just a moral story, it's also a practical one. And so at the heart of that In the UK, what does that mean, right? To enact meaningful solidarity and practice and work with boldness, with imagination, with tangibility. And so the reason why land and assets and physical infrastructure become so important for us was for a number of big reasons. There is an historical and ancestral story, and we can talk about that, but there's people in this room who could talk about that even better. There's a story around what has happened in the UK around our infrastructure and what austerity finished off, a journey that we could take back 400 years, or we could take back to Margaret Thatcher, or we could take back to the beginning of this cycle of austerity. Whichever arc you want to go down, we can see that we're in the arse end of a story that is incredibly, incredibly at the heart of this. And finally, within this, land and physical buildings and assets hold 90% of the UK's wealth. Right? So follow Alistair Parvin's land contract video and just watch it. He'll explain the UK land system. And therefore, to pretend any kind of meaningful sovereignty, any kind of meaningful stewardship, any kind of meaningful action can be taken without distributing that power and resource in the way that Kate would talk about radically, means that it's, even if you don't believe in it morally, how is anybody meant to physically get on with anything when the deepest sources of power and mobilization in this country are held by such a few people? Now, if we're in a different country or a different context where it didn't hold so much power, it wouldn't matter so much. If it was normal to rent, if it was normal to pass things on, if wealth wasn't held in that way, we wouldn't need to be hacking at this. But as you'll know, in the UK, many, many different people at different scales, from reparations to infrastructure building to black land and spatial justice to many, many different stories, have been hacking at the root of this system at many different ways. And so for us, when it came to building civic infrastructure that is putting people at the forefront, communities at the forefront of being able to deal with this transition, the acquisition and stewardship of land, and in this current system, like I said, with one foot in today, the ownership of it was really, really critical. The full and bold and open freehold, so we could rewrite the rules of this system and create new ones that are about how we create a different relationship with the land, one in which we steward and we are in relationship with it, and we can start to look at the incredible practice that our elders and our ancestors and Indigenous folks from across different backgrounds and different parts of the world and different lands have shown us is possible to have a very different, less subjugative, less control over relationship with the land. And so starting at that layer has been a really, really critical one. And so after many years of work, I can't tell you about all of it, we were battling and grappling away over the last few to make true on a possibility to buy quite a large site in inner city Birmingham. That, cut a long story short, everybody upon everybody had told us it wasn't possible. We were laughed out of the room of many funders. We were told, cute, this is nice, carry on like this, but when you come over here to this level of ambition, not for you guys. Do this bit, do those projects, dream it, vision it, think about it, but you can't do that bit. And the chasm in that, the stories I could tell you, are brutal, and they aren't just experienced by us. I was lucky to get up here and talk. This is in communities across the country. Community organisations, the type of activists and movements we work with, are infantilized, are made to feel like they don't know what they're doing, are made to feel that it's too big and too complex, that it couldn't possibly be for them, and so on and so on and so on. And so we were at a right rut with a big foundation, UK foundation that I won't mention the name of, had just completely dropped us at 6 months to go before we had a deal, an incredibly radical full freehold deal that we had negotiated, and they had made us the darling of them, and all sorts of things had happened in 6 months before the final deadline. And we had worked, I can't even tell you how hard we'd worked to get to that point. They were like, sorry, this is a bit too ambitious, and they dropped us. They dropped us hard and brutally and in a really humiliating way. And so a different story was born. We were very ready and very much like had a very deep and broad proposition across many layers, which I'll talk about later when we talk a bit more about the money and the wider propositions this work sits within, and what y'all can all do as well from philanthropy, because one of the things I really think is so important is not only were we treated not that great, and there's lots of racialized risk and infantilization of this type of work, There's also a huge story to be told here about how wealth and philanthropy in the UK have forgotten how powerful they could be. If we do have to have that system for now, you've completely forgotten what you've managed to do in the past and what that can look like, which I'll talk about later because my time is now up. And just to say, so then we get to this moment, and in enter two incredible women who, in their own ways, were leading bold experiments in their own spaces with the Good Ancestor Movement and Steph, and in meeting Raji at the Tudor Trust. And there was something that was really interesting for me that I just want to tee this up with, is in our own spaces, we were all up against it. We were all up against it, and at different scales, everybody was telling us the thing that we were saying wasn't possible. And that's what was the beginning of a whole different story. And so within 6 days of the final deadline, on December the 23rd at 6:45, having found the last possible person in a huge chain at Homes England who was at his Christmas party and we had to drag him out because he was the last guy that needed to sign a covenant, we completed on the purchase of the site. And thank you. And the whole and detailed 15-year story is written up on this on purpose to allow it to never take anybody else 15 years, but also to really start to look at what it looks like. And some other things have happened, which I won't share right now. But the most important thing that I wanted to say is that through grit and determination and an unwavering belief in it wasn't, and this is really, not in like revolution, let's bring everything down, like I'm fully here for that, by the way. Like many of you who know my politics will be like, I'll be out with you on the front lines when it's needed. But that isn't always what's needed. Actually, all of us were just asking a few slight, not even harder questions, just a little bit of like, well, why can't we? And so working with Raji and Steph to make that happen and to start to create the blueprint of how this can start to be a story within which the resources, the land, the assets can be back in the hands of communities that can create wealth and resilience and imagination and creativity, I guess is the story of this panel. And I'm going to pause there for a second to let Raji do her intro. And then I guess we can get into it as well.
Yeah. We can get into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so lovely to start after lunch with a good story and a good outcome and something that feels that we can all sort of rally behind. And I think there are some really important learnings for philanthropy and people who are shifting any kind of wealth to think about in this story. And I think that really starting with where I was at the Tudor Trust is that in 2023, I took over the Tudor Trust at a time where the family that was the Tudor Trust had been on its own journey of understanding the challenges and the extractive nature of philanthropy and had wanted to think about how to steward Tudor differently. And actually, one of the bravest and most courageous things they did was say, actually, it's time for us to exit and for a new Tudor to be born. And it was that journey that started my role as the CEO of the Tudor Trust. And so for me, I think a really important lesson for anyone who is thinking about moving money is that there was no way Tudor was ready to move lots of money in that moment. We were so fragile and the media were after us. And I think one of the things that was really, really important, I think Kate did this morning so well, and then others have done it on other panels as well, is that you need to know your story. Like, what is the story you want to tell? What are you imagining? So I was sort of imagining this world where we weren't necessarily talking about extractive philanthropy and how terrible funders were. And we were centering communities, and communities were living a more regenerative way, a more sort of a thriving way of being. And so for me, the most important thing in that story is that the outcome isn't the land acquisition, right? And I think that's what Kate was trying to say to us this morning. the outcome is the story, is that you achieve what you wanted to achieve in your story. And for me, that was about justice-led approaches to how people could live their lives in ways that were more regenerative and sustainable. And I think for someone like me, whose job it was to kind of do something about that, right? That's the bit, isn't it? How do you actually go about doing something about that? And I think that's the bit where you hold the transactional. So we've got an endowment, right? That's the transactional, that's the value. And then you hold the imagination, which is the belief. And the minute you think you know what the thing is, you're just going to recreate what's already going on in the system. So you kind of really have to hold imagination. But then you've got to do something. And so for me, the learning has been find the work that has readiness in it. So we didn't have readiness, but the work did. There were others that had that ambition. And so what we were able to do was create our new way of distributing funding through the lens of those who were ready to receive that funding. And that, I think, was, without me realizing it at the time, that was the beginning of Power With. You know, we talk about Power With in that sort of, how do you do it, as though it's impossible. We talk about things as though they're impossible. But actually, one of the best lessons I learned was, you have to assume you can do it. You ought to do it. So how will we know when it's done? And it's taken me 2.5 years, and it's only just occurred to me, actually what we did was Power With, because we needed each other. I could not have developed Tudor's approach to funding without projects like Civic Square and Good Ancestor Movement and Land in Our Names and others that are in this room. We could not have done it without you. And equally, you wouldn't be having this land purchase without the work we did.
Yeah.
So that is Power With, and that's for me the story.
Thank you. Yeah. Steph, I wondered if you wanted to share a bit on, or as well from Good Ancestor Movement side, just shortly on the...
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was, it's quite overwhelming actually to sort of be here. And I came across Civic Square's work in 2020 when I was like sat on my living room floor, sort of plotting my escape from the law. I was still practicing as a lawyer, and I thought, you know, I was sort of developing the blueprint for the Good Ancestor Movement, and I came across this work and thought, this is exactly the stuff that mainstream philanthropy won't fund abundantly, and this is exactly, you know, this is perfect for the power of private capital, which has the capacity to move in a way that is agile and in right relationship. And so it was always this dream, really, to sort of be involved in supporting Civic Square in some way. And I think the important thing to mention is that before any money got involved, or resource mobilization as we call it, we spent a lot of time just building relationship. So Kiki and I, 3 years ago, went up to Birmingham, went to the sites even, spent time together, began to understand the work, because for those of us who are working with resources, financial resources, and more particularly within philanthropy, there is an assumption that we understand what should be funded and why. And so we did a lot of learning and had a foundation of trust, really, that enabled us to move quickly when we had to. And so, yeah, I suppose, Kiki, you spoke to it earlier, right? We were trying among our experiments to demonstrate what can it look like to mobilize private capital in a way that is catalytic, so in a way that can unlock further capital, but also to look at demonstrating what it means to practice non-extractive finance. Now, you know, you can find one of us later to get into what we mean by that. But, you know, essentially centering the needs of communities and not continuing to extract from them. Just last week, I was having a conversation with someone, a brilliant leader organising in a community who needs access to finance and is faced with the prospect of taking out repayable finance at 4%. Now, maybe 4% doesn't sound like a lot to people in this room, but that's 4% that they could be reinvesting back into their operations, not just to survive, but to actually do their work in a space of expansiveness and abundance. So we were interested in what it can look like if we mobilize our community of wealth holders to provide non-extractive capital. And yeah, I mean, I think I'll stop there, but I just wanted to really emphasize the importance of the relationship before we even started to mobilize, and we had to do it quickly. And I guess, you know, I'll end by saying, and I think this will come up again during the panel, but I've been reflecting a lot, particularly after a recent experience of needing to mobilize very quickly around a capital campaign, that the thing that stands in the gap between having a dream and a desire and, you know, witnessing a group, a collective, an organization in their dreams, in their hopes, and to getting it done is personal discomfort. Like, that's the thing that we don't talk about. And we'll probably get into that, but I just want to leave that bomb hanging there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, this was already, we've heard a lot from like key people involved in the process, but I feel like Sunghae will lead us into a whole nother sphere of this work, which we haven't at all talked about, which is the whole the legal side of it, the so-called, I mean, it's sometimes referred to as boring revolution in terms of what do we need to change on paper. And yeah, so handing to you, Sunghae, to hear a little bit from being involved in this work, but also beyond that, you do a lot to kind of try and see how those legal documents that are so required still can become more equitable. Yeah, to share a bit on your experience in it.
Thank you very much, Kiki. So in terms of how I got involved in this story was that one of our mutual friends, who I think is in the room, Bonnie Chu, introduced us. Because I think the Good Ancestor Movement team were looking for lawyers to paper this arrangement, particularly the relationship between GAM and wealth holders in terms of providing their financial capital, and then in turn that flow of money into Civic Square, but in a way that still held that solidarity and mission and didn't inadvertently jeopardize the process, as unfortunately legal processes can do. And so it was a real kind of pleasure working with the whole team. And I think what you said, Steph, about personal discomfort is actually incredibly important, especially for lawyers. And I can understand why you kind of wanted to flee the law in some ways when you are a lawyer working in very traditional investment kind of practices, because the way that you are trained as a lawyer is as a guardian of capital. And what I mean by that is some of you might be familiar with the work of Katerina Pistor, who's at Columbia. But one of the aspects of the law and of lawyering, which causes so many problems for us who want to work for a regenerative society, is that we are the pit bulls in some ways of those who have wealth and power and want to keep it that way. And that means that there are laws that safeguard assets in that way, but even the role of lawyers in documents and agreements can reflect that attitude. So for example, lawyers are taught at law school and when they're training that to be a good lawyer, you have to minimize risk for your client at all costs, even if you push it all to the other side. It's what Kate talked about before, about the economic rational man who is always looking after his own interests. So the other facet of being a lawyer is don't trust anyone else. No one can be trusted, everyone is out for themselves, so you have to fight to get what you want. And then kind of the third facet of this is that those who have the money know best. And we see this attitude even as lawyers inadvertently in some of the funder clients that we work with, but even those who have learned experience, who go to the big business schools, the law schools, who work in investment banking, they come into this sphere with the best will in the world, but because they went to Harvard or whatever it was, they feel like they know much better than those community activists and organizations who have lived the social and environmental issues for decades and are closest to knowing the solutions to it. So all of these elements, Kiki, are kind of present in how lawyering can go wrong and uphold extractive rather than regenerative approaches. And when we worked with Imi and Steph and Kiki, what they were so good at doing was saying, you know what we actually want you to do in these agreements is to reflect the reality of our relationships, please. Please, like, put aside your assumptions about having to get the best deal for us, about having to minimize risk. Can we just reflect this kind of trust-based, relational, community-focused approach in the documents? And when I was first kind of asked to do this many years ago, I think it was Lankelly Chase who first challenged me to think like that. I was just bamboozled at how you could do that and how you could trust so much in the documents. But I think when you realize actually the role of law and lawyers is not to be the pit bulls of the wealthy and the powerful, but we can be a facilitator and an enabler of regenerative relationships and paper the equitable sharing of risk and opportunity between the parties, then it really does open up your world, at first in a way that's quite uncomfortable, but in a way that's actually quite inspiring and creative as a lawyer. So what we really enjoyed doing as part of the Civic Square kind of matter was kind of reflecting terms, and also I think there was a part on GAM's side of educating the wealth holders about how they didn't need to control everything, and how it was okay to not get the money back directly, but to put it into community at the end of the repayable grant term and let the community kind of decide what to do with that money. But what I really liked there was that you went even beyond that interpersonal discomfort and said, you know what, let's not do the opposite thing and leave out the wealth holder. Let's not make the wealth holder out to be the bad guy, because sometimes when in the narratives that we work with, it shifts to the other extreme sometimes. But no, let's bring the wealth holder into community. Let's get their views, make sure that we consult with them, make them feel included as part of this family. And so it was a really good experience for us to be able to do that work together.
Just to build on the legal piece, on the other side of the deal was like a year of detailed negotiation between us as an organisation and multiple complex landholders and covenant holders, and it was eye-opening. And I just want to add to say that we worked with a very different team at Bates Wells on this as well. And just to give you an idea of the extent of legal work that happened on that side, we had a weekly call where we went through line by line, nearly 900 pages of a land deal, and rewrote and redesigned and discussed every layer with a very, like, this system landowner, and had to negotiate that with then 3 or 4 other folks that were involved in this story, including public and private landowners. And so just to say that there is something really important about what Raji said about, like, once you get past the kind of like, what am I going to do? I agree there's a problem, I maybe want to give away or invest resource or whatever. There's like real hard and detailed work that has to happen. And for us, in the other side, the legal team were huge enablers, because once they got over this idea of like, okay, we are working with the existing land system, so they were there to protect us as well, right? From being like too naive and just like, oh, we want it all to be great. But once they got over it was just the best for them at all costs, and we all just had behaved like monsters. Actually, it was such an enabling year, because we learned so much just by turning over every part. And now we have like a really, really really good relationship with the landowner, we're now the landowners, but we're going to be stewards.
Freeholders.
We're freeholders for now, but like, we don't believe in the ownership and subjugation of land, so we'll be moving beyond that. But my point is like, we learnt so much, And again, the legal folks within that, and I know many of you know like really game-changing legal designers and folks, people like Jackie Tan and so on, like they were all enablers in this. Yeah. And so there's something that's just come to me, which was like we had really plural, respectful, practical and tangible partnerships amongst us. Actually, it's something that we weren't, there were times where the rage ignited, and that was not to do with what we were all stewarding, but how much actually when you just put the mission at the heart and kind of commit to the design and redesign and not see the lawyers as the blockers and not see the landowner who's trying to give us, trying to sell us this land and he's trying to show us, here's 900 pages of stuff we have to agree on, right? Like, and it just changed. And I think that was also in our relationship. It was just a very, very like relational and technical and practical approach. And I just wanted to say that like if you are really fully in the existing system philanthropy space, I just want to give a shout out that everything that got us ready and stood by us during the pandemic and all of that were folks like Family Foundation, 30 Percy Foundation, who were the first to move, some of the other larger philanthropy foundations like Paul Hamlin and Esme Fairburn. And why that matters is because if that is firmly your lane, and you want to do something massively transformative, you can be an enabler for readiness, right? And I just want to say that I want to give a big shout out to them, to others who supported us. So, yeah, Louisa's here in the room. Louisa's in the room. Cassie Robinson, folks who supported us on those layers, because even if you can't transform the whole thing, the reason we were ready this many years later was to then meet the more transformative part of the system, was because philanthropy also tried to take some risks and were like, okay, these guys aren't. Because a lot of people called us absolutely bonkers when we were kids and saying we're going to go to this scale. And they were like, we back this. So I also think that there's like, as long as you don't see it as the answer, as long as you're not like, this is it, charity, gifts, PR for what I'm doing, as the answer, you can be a really enabling force in supporting people's needs, in supporting the readiness, in supporting leadership. It's just really important to make sure that that isn't the end, because that system was then the same thing that retracted on us and said, no, we like to keep you in your lane. We didn't actually say you could do this thing. So it's like, you know, that's where the kind of work that these guys were doing had to meet to take us beyond and take us into bigger sums and bigger possibility and bigger belief as well.
I think there's something really important that's emerging here, and I think that the key to this is that relationship piece and that personal readiness, that personal belief, and how we can end up sort of being our own blockers, because actually so much of this story is about rewiring the system to be about, we can do this, we ought to do it, and the risk of not doing it becomes far greater than the risk of doing it and making a legal mistake or any other mistake, because so many of these things ultimately, you know, if you're trying to meet your charitable objectives, then you can justify a lot of those legal mistakes. So, you know, in our learning, there were a few things that the auditor picked up at the end of our year and sort of went, you could have done that better. And we were like, yeah, we probably could have, but we learned from that and we now do it better. And they were like, yeah, but, and we were like, no, but. If we had waited for certainty, then we wouldn't have been able to fund this work. That land would have been lost and no charitable objectives would have been met. And that is a greater risk than us, you know, a tweak that we could have made in the paperwork that we've since made and we know now how to make it. So, and I think it's the same story. We've talked about it through the lens of law. It's the regulation. It's the same conversation we've had with the Charity Commission, you know, about sort of actually we have forgotten our purpose here. Our purpose is to make things happen so that we are achieving a more just society. And we've convinced ourselves our job is to police the system. That is not what we're here to do. And it's important that we have the bravery to have those conversations together. And we can only do that if the relationship is there Because if I turn around and Stephanie and Imi aren't there and I'm the only one saying it, I'm screwed. But the minute we are doing these things in community, we can hold each other through things that can feel very difficult and sometimes impossible.
I was thinking about what you were saying, Sanghet, just reflecting on charity law. And because I know there's a lot of funders from institutional philanthropy here today, and I always used to say, like, charities where social justice goes to die. Yeah. But it's not quite, it's not quite like that. But I was thinking about an analogy, because it's a conversation that's quite difficult to talk about, because we all of us in this room are involved in change work. That's what we do. Some folks are funders, some folks are resource mobilizers like us, some folks are in communities organizing, but we're all in the work of change. I believe that's how it's helpful for me to see it. And I guess when I think about charity law, I think about soil and like what's good soil, and just something that I hope that will help folks to hold on to what's behind this analogy, the ideas behind this analogy, that, what we are striving for unapologetically is a more just world and just futures for everyone. And that mission doesn't survive well in the soil that is the charity law framework. And so I guess I just want to bring to mind the idea of what are the conditions that we're creating, and what is good soil? What does good soil look like for the kind of work that we need to do to achieve the outcomes that we want?
Just on that, if I may. So we have seen kind of two main types of responses to your point, Steph, about kind of charity law and kind of enabling soil. One is that we often find that charities, trustees are very scared about liability, especially in light of things like Kids Company over the last few years, where there was a wind down situation, and there was a big kind of media focus on trustees' duties, and that sometimes can lead to trustees maybe undermining the level of flexibility that they actually have under existing charity law frameworks to put communities first. And that is especially if their charitable objects are to challenge inequality or combat poverty, etc. I think some of the things that have been a blocker to that, maybe self-imposed blockers, are things like the notion of safeguarding charity assets, which is also a tenet of charity law, but that's what causes a lot of the confusion. But I think if you and it's what leads some charity funders to control everything that their recipients do, maybe overly control, because again, there is that narrative of maybe they know best on how to use the money. But we are seeing more and more charitable funders taking that step of personal discomfort of letting go and trusting, but having a really good dialogue with those that they fund, building a really good relationship with those they fund, so that even within the parameters of charity law, they can be more light touch, more equitable, and further their charitable objects more. The other side of that is where we have come across some kind of wealth holders and others who get quite frustrated about how others interpret charity law. So sometimes when you have wealth holders who set up donor advised funds, DAFs, and those DAFs can be very kind of conservative and rigid about how they interpret charity law, but they don't have the time to just set up their own charity, which can itself be quite a laborious process. You don't have to have a charity to give money. You can just give the money, but you just don't have the tax benefits from it. And is that important? So it's amazing how much flexibility you have as a philanthropist or a wealth holder to just give without a charity framework. And we work with kind of the GAM team and others, and it is quite freeing as a lawyer to be like, you can basically write what you like in this agreement, because there are no charity law restrictions that impose what you have to do in terms of use of funds or clawback or reporting or all these kinds of things. So it feels like it's a little bit out there as a lawyer for me to say this, but there are different ways that you can mobilize capital for impact.
Thank you.
In the far right context as well. You've got to talk about that before
We have about 10 minutes, but I want one more point. You kind of hinted already, Raji, towards it with the aspect of like the risk of not doing anything is actually far greater than just the risk of doing mistakes along the way, failing, having to learn as you try. So I wanted to know if you could go a bit into that in terms of what is it that we need to be doing that we can't shy away from not doing. Again, contextualizing us in this moment and the rise of authoritarianism and
I think that was such a perfect segue, because basically I think we can move money at scale and quickly. And I think we've convinced ourselves we can't do that. And we've convinced ourselves we've got to decide what it is that we put our money on. And the minute we've decided what it is where we need to put our money, we probably won't be as effective. And so I think, that we're trying to segment too much. And I love a framework. I'm a fan of a framework because a framework helps you to see complexity. But a framework should never stop you from acting. And so we need to bring together what it means to be in a space with movement builders who are meeting the very moment, are fighting the very system at the front line in the way that many of our communities and the charities that we are organisations we are supporting are doing. And then those that have the imagination to think differently and not see them in opposition, see them together. And the best way to enable them to be seen together is to move away from scarcity and to believe in abundance. And to believe in abundance, we need to move money at scale. And we can do that. We don't have to have individual donor advice funds. We don't need to have our own systems. We can do it in one system. We've just convinced ourselves we can't.
Does anyone want to?
I just wanted to say a little bit about this, like meeting this moment thing, because it is kind of like in the UK, like in England, in this, where do we think we're heading? Like a genuine, and I say on LinkedIn, I sometimes have a outburst because I'm like, I'm not actually being aggressive. I'm like, guys, what do we think we're doing? Like, can we have a little bit of consensus, roughly, to what the goal of, say, the next decade looks like? Do we generally think it's a good idea to avert the worst of far-right fascism and authoritarianism, whilst also building the more regenerative and transformative futures? If we do, what do we think we need to do about that? Because, like I said in the multi-solving piece, you can't have we'll deal with this first, and then we'll do climate resilience, then we'll build a donut economy, then we'll change the materials our buildings built out of. I'm just talking to people I know in the room, right? We'll do it one after the other, and it will depend what wealthy person decides which segment they're going for, which one's their chosen track. Does it link? We do have to understand that this is completely not commensurate with where we're heading, but also just not even slightly closely organised to how the extreme far right is mobilising in all the things we heard earlier, right? And why I'm asking this is because we need to sit up straight and be like, right, what are we doing? And I'm always in disbelief when I'm in spaces and I'm like, am I seeing the world the same? Because we may have passed 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, but similarly, if we lose the social contract before that, we're going to have a whole load of, lose it even more than we've already lost, the social contract. We're going to lose way more than much more quickly. And it's this thing about being uncomfortable. What an unbelievable freaking privilege to sit in the UK having decimated half of the planet and caused half of the chaos that we have. And I say we in the broadest sense, not literally not we we went and did it. And then to say, hold on, well, you know what, it's quite uncomfortable and hard to have the privilege and position on this small little tiny island to fight the far right and rebuild our infrastructure in a just and regenerative vision. So I do think it's really important that people, all of us, need to take that like personal discomfort like way more seriously and sit up straight and organize, like Steph often says, as if we believe we can win.
Yeah.
And then get some broad goals about what we think winning looks like, because it isn't going to be any one of our perfect visions. And it might just be averting the worst of it all for a while before we start to build. But I don't feel that. And I don't feel that. I don't feel like we are like on a journey. And so that's why I think this bit is so important, because I don't want you to take away from this that Civic Square bought some land, and hopefully what's happening is that they're lifting the window up for this to happen for loads of other people. That's what we're trying to work towards, right? But now that isn't what the story here is. The story of what you talked about is critical. The one thing that the U-bend of and sorry for this language, far left and the far right, I don't actually believe in those two things, but I just can't think of anything else, agree on is that, like, they blame very different things, but they agree on our physical spaces, our pubs, our high streets, our infrastructure, our opportunities for our children, the jobs and skills. And the deeper you get into it in the movements, we have like really thoughtful global solidarities with the materials we use and how extraction works and all of that. Brilliant, right? We have that depth also growing at the same time. And so it's really critical that we actually mobilize to start to rebuild the creative, imaginative, bold, but also tangible power base that is in taking back our land and assets and other things from privatization, is in building spaces in which community and climate resilience can grow. That can look super practical, whatever place you're from, whatever street corner you want to take stewardship for, whatever bigger story or smaller story that you want to. So I do really think, like, the last thing I want you to do is go, I heard this great story about Civic Square, because that's cool. But guys, like, my invitation is that we need to move money at scale really boldly at the intersections that I talked about and many others, with many different starting points. And we don't have to centralize it like the far right have. People like Kate and many others have created beautiful models that show we can distribute that and we can fight it on many fronts. But we actually have to start doing, because when you start doing and you're not just immobilized by framework after framework over what's my perfect one investment, you will start to make investments, you will start to fund, you will start to resource. And I could sit and do a presentation of 100 Civic Squares. And just so important to make sure that it is really clear that it is both about future building, world building, regenerative futures, and meeting this moment with intention, clarity, and as if we want to win a better world for ourselves, for our future generations, and in solidarity for all of those who fought to get us to be able to sit in this room and wonder whether we might be able to do it. And I just want to really underline that, because the last thing I want is like, oh, that was a great talk by Civic Square. It's not the point. We're a fractal of a far greater story, and you guys all need to believe in that power in order to start writing your checks and getting going and getting proximate as well.
We want Steph for closing reflection, but you want to say something quickly on that?
There's one thing I think that's missing that's really important. Sorry, there's one thing that I feel that, I know we're nearly at 3, but I think it is missing and it's really important, which is the whole thing about behaviours. I think we always go for values, and the problem with values is that we can share the same values in theory, but in practice they can feel very different. I think what a behaviours framework allows you to do is to step into a space with whatever behaviour it is. For us, it's curiosity, and so it means we don't have to wait till we know the whole story. You can step into relationship with community without really fully understanding that community, as long as you do it with the right behaviours. Ours are humility, curiosity, but the one that I think is really, really important, because you will get it wrong, we all get it wrong, right? So for me, compassion is the most important, because for me that's the one about forgiveness, and it's about having forgiveness for yourself and for each other, because we are entering into a way of working that none of us really know, and if we wait for certainty we won't get anywhere. And I do think the behaviours alongside the legal is really important in that.
Thank you. I agree. Yeah, very much. Thank you. I will, just because of time, I will ask Steph to. I wondered if you would share some closing reflections, kind of.
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking again back to the deal, the process that we had to undergo to mobilise the resources for Civic Square to acquire the land, and I just think about like the simple things, like what did that take? What did that take? Well, it took a lot of honesty. It took for us to have to look within ourselves and make sure that we are building this like internal architecture of humility, an ability to listen, and really to manage our own internal projections around risk and what that means. And I guess I'm just thinking a couple of weeks ago, there were two people in this room where there was a resourcing need that emerged that was very clear. And it was like, this is not going to fit within our current strategy, or it's not, we don't have the capacity. I'm not sure whether this is the right thing to do. And instead of, I kind of internally combusted for a while. And then I thought, I'm going to have to ask for help here. And I reached out to two of our beloved kin in our community and said, I need help and I need your opinion. And we shared voice notes and we strategized. And we're currently in the process of a capital campaign, which is raising some capital for an amazing community. And why that's important is that some of the moments that we are working with, like the leverage that we have now, there's the bigger arc of like what financial capital is worth now in this time limit. But then there are these short-term moments, like with Civic Square, where if one of the key strategies is to take land out of speculation, to disrupt that cycle of enormous institutions buying up land, concentrating wealth and power by doing that, and creating housing scarcity and asset price inflation. If we're going to interrupt that in order to enable communities to acquire land and steward it in perpetuity, we are going to have to move quickly and at scale. And we can only do that if we're honest about the things that come up for us internally that might block us from actually moving in the ways that we need to.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to rewind a few pieces that came up, like the contradictions that Imi mentioned early on of like having to still have one foot in the system, right? Having to deal with the fact that now you're a landowner, but ultimately that's just a part of the process of the longer journey. The story being actually really the core driver of it, not the immediate outcome of like supporting someone to acquire land, but really what's the story. That's at key. Also behavior having been mentioned, which I think also leads a little bit links to Songha as well, like behavior of everyone involved. How do we show up in this work? How are we courageous, bold, but also vulnerable, listen, right? Curious and learn. And step into discomfort, that was also mentioned. And yeah, I guess the final message also that we all have a stake in this. There is a role for everyone in ensuring that we can move at pace and scale. So yeah, let's get going, I would say. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kiki.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much to the panel. I'm sure you found that inspiring. Yes, there's a lot of nodding. We're going to take a 25-minute break. So if you want to find your way out there again, and when we come back in this room at 3:30, there'll be some film screenings, or in the Waldo Williams, we've got Insight to Action, connecting interventions to shift the wealth system, which will be facilitated by Jess Hackett. So go, make connections, look at the resources, keep talking, and see you back here in 25 minutes.